Now, in thinking of these plot structures, they don't necessarily come out in the same order every single time, but we're going to try and go through them in relative order. Dilemma is a very, very interesting concept. It's any kind of problem situation where there may be a number of solutions, but none of the solutions seem appropriate to the hero. In fact, the more inappropriate they are and the more undesirable they are, the more potential for drama and conflict there is. And then, the hero squirms, right? Because they don't want to take action on any of these things. And ultimately what often happens is that there's a crisis that forces the hero to decide upon a line of action. And so some antagonistic force is forcing the hero to deal with this dilemma. And a lot of people have argued that Oedipus is about his pride, and the fact that he tries to solve this plague demonstrates his pride and his greatness and his ego, that he would somehow think that he could tackle something as huge as a plague. But if this interpretation is true, then Oedipus is really just full of himself, and his investigation into the past is nothing more than a vanity quest. I think it's more complicated than that, and in looking at this dilemma, a huge part of it involves the fact that Oedipus genuinely wants to solve the plague because he's a good person. He became king by saving Thebes when he solved the riddle of the Sphinx, and now he intends to save the city again. And added to the mix, Oedipus is adamant about finding the man who killed the previous king. He just doesn't know yet that he's the guy who killed the king. And so the play is about the discovery of truth and about a person who's good enough to take upon himself that quest, even when looking for the truth gets uncomfortable. And it's about how to live in the world as someone who is devoted to getting to the bottom of things. So Oedipus's actions don't come from vanity, they come from his need for justice. They don't come from self-servitude, they come from him wanting to not be blind, wanting to know himself. And so it's interesting that he winds up blinding himself, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But there would be no catharsis, there would be no pity, there would be no suffering, and there would be no way for us to connect with any of this if it was just about him being a vacuous person with no substance. In this play, the core dilemma for Oedipus is partly his distrust of the oracles. He had once been told by an oracle that he would kill his parents, something he thought he had prevented by leaving Corinth, where they lived, and so that he wouldn't harm them. And because his devotion to solving the plague ends up entertaining certain things that he knows cannot be true, or feels that cannot be true, the discoveries lead to more and more discoveries, and it presses him onward, not just to know the truth of his origin, but to get justice. Because there's something about him being denied the truth because of the role of oracles and not being able to trust them. And there's a justice element to that. And he's like us. We need to know as much as possible about ourselves. We want to know our origins. And when we feel that something is false, like some prediction is false, we may want to go after that and figure out the truth. So the details of his life just don't add up. And when you read assessments of this play that he has a tragic flaw and so on, it's not a tragic flaw to want to know more about yourself. It isn't pride or evil or moral weakness. The flaw that Oedipus has is the flaw that we all have, and that's that we don't know who we are. And ironically, for Oedipus, his strength, along with his sense of justice, is figuring out the origin of things. He solved the riddle of the Sphinx, and he figured out the origin of things, so he wants to solve the riddle of himself. And in many ways, that's what we want. We want to solve the riddle of ourselves, and yet we have to think about how we can do that in a way that isn't poisonous, that it doesn't cause more plague and more disease. So I want to introduce something from Jacques Derrida. He uses this term pharmakon, which Derrida claims could be used in ancient Greek to describe substances that act as both a medicine and a poison at the same time. And so you might notice a similarity with this word pharmakon to pharmacy, which we use today as the place where you can buy substances like this. Every medicine you buy could be poisonous to you, and there are certainly some things in there that will be poisonous if you don't need them, even though they may have curative properties for other people. And you might think about fertilizer. So this is another thing that Gilles Deleuze talks about, where fertilizer that goes on the soil can help a plant grow, but if you put that same fertilizer on the leaf of a plant, it will burn the leaves of the plant and kill it. So there's something about the poison having curative properties and a cure having poisonous properties. So it doesn't have to be medicine, though. It doesn't have to be fertilizer that can be a poison that has a cure and a cure that has a poison. It doesn't have to be literal. For example, if you think of the Lord of the Rings, there's a ring that gives people fantastic powers. They can become invisible. But at the same time, it makes them ill. So that's a narrative symbolic example of that. And in Oedipus, his sense of justice and his detective abilities have curative properties for Thebes. But even though they have these positive characteristics, it ultimately destroys him. So the thing that cures is also a poison. And this all leads to the acts that he takes, the decision that he makes, and then it leads to the resolution. So adding irony upon irony, after he takes action, a complete and whole action, as Aristotle describes as being important to stories, he then winds up blinding himself in order to resolve the story. Now it's an unusual but very fitting punishment because Oedipus failed to see what was in front of his eyes all along. He failed to see it so much that he married his own mother and had children that grew up. He was metaphorically blind, and so he completed that blindness by making himself physically blind as well. And so this act serves as resolution to the crisis of the story, and that crisis is a combination of Thebes being under siege by a plague and the crisis of him needing to confront his true identity. And that identity is the cure that poisons and the poison that cures. Very interesting way of thinking about it. And it all comes down to suffering and catharsis, which we've talked about. So why that this story works on such a global scale on the imaginations of every human around the world, and why it's stood the test of time, is because we feel pity for this. We feel pity for the Oedipus character for the reasons that Aristotle suggests. And even as a murderer, he's essentially a good person, and we identify with his quest for knowledge, and we feel pity because we see him suffer for reasons that are beyond his control. And we also identify with him because he takes action. He's not this passive victim who just accepts his fate, even though every action he takes brings him closer and closer to actualizing a preordained outcome, which is what we're going to see happens in the movie Minority Report. But he suffers because of this, and he doesn't deserve to suffer. Suffering is a universal problem that we all come up against at one time or another, sometimes on a daily basis, but we don't necessarily blind ourselves. But when Oedipus blinds himself by taking out his own eyes, he undergoes this purging catharsis. We feel it in our gut as we go along with him. We feel it and we share his position. We experience the real pain of his psychological suffering, and depending on the strength of our imagination, we feel the physical pain as well, and we feel that sense that by making that physical punishment on himself, he'll be able to purge the emotions that go along with that. So we're going to turn to look more at the structure of Oedipus in the next video.